a single iron teacup, and a clue no one noticed except Miss Marple. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Alexander. Let's grow this mystery-loving community comment where you're watching from. I always look forward to reading your thoughts. Let's begin. The sun filtered gently through the soft clouds above Little Whitechford, one of those timeless English villages where life moved at a pleasant dawdle and scandal rarely stretched beyond a poorly made spo. Cake at the Women's Institute, a gentle breeze nudged the rose bushes at the edge of the Vicarage lawn, sending petals fluttering to the grass like polite confetti. The annual garden party was in full swing, complete with bunting, tea cakes, and the hum of mild conversation, only punctuated by the sharper clinks of fine china and the occasional squawk from Mrs. Pendleton's parrot, who had been brought out for the occasion in a dreadful-looking wicker cage. Miss Marple, a sprightly figure in pale lavender, sat near the edge of the gathering beneath the shade of a pear tree, her knitting needles clicking with quiet purpose. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. She nodded politely at the vicar's wife, took note of the unusual tension in Colonel Fanshaw's posture, and observed with some curiosity how Mrs. Isabel Price, recently returned from India and far too elegantly dressed for such a provincial affair, kept stealing glances toward the tea table. There had been some mild buzz about Mrs. Price's return. Widow of a former trade commissioner, she had inherited a fortune, a reputation for having seen things, and a cottage on Honeysuckle Lane. And though she affected an air of foreign aloofness, she was thoroughly enmeshed in village affairs within days. To Miss Marple's seasoned eye, this reintegration was almost too swift. It suggested either a desperate desire for belonging or something more deliberate. As the brass quartet struck up a hesitant rendition of Greensleeves, conversation meandered between cucumber sandwiches and parish matters. Then came the scream. It tore through the afternoon like a violent gust of wind, bringing the event to a screeching halt. Miss Beatrice Bunny Ellison spinster, bridge enthusiast, and formidable treasurer of the village committee stood frozen near the refreshment tent, her face a blotchy map of horror. "She's dead," Bunny cried, pointing toward the trestle table, covered in linen and adorned with a gleaming tea set. "She's just sitting there and she won't move." All heads turned. The crowd parted hesitantly like theatrogoers reluctant to admit the play had taken a dark turn. There sat Mrs. Isabel Price, upright in her white wicker chair, a half-finished cup of Earl Grey before her. One gloved hand rested lightly on her lap. Her lips were slightly parted, eyes fixed on the hydrangeas across the lawn. There was something almost peaceful in her stillness until one noticed the unnatural tilt of her neck and the faint greyish hue around her mouth. The vicar's wife fainted. Colonel Fanshawe let out a stunned oath. And somewhere in the chaos, a delicate iron teacup slipped from a trembling hand and hit the ground with a muffled clink. Miss Marple did not rise immediately. She placed her knitting neatly into her basket, retrieved her gloves, and stood peering calmly at the scene. She did not rush forward, nor did she speak, but her eyes were already flicking over the table, the cup, and the curious look of satisfaction that had flickered only for a second across someone's face in the crowd. The murder had come to Little Whitechford, but the killer, Miss Marple knew, had likely been among them for quite some time. By early evening, the bunting still fluttered in the breeze, but the laughter had long since evaporated. The garden party at the Vicarage, intended as a cheerful midsummer affair, was now spoken of in hushed tones along the hedgerows and cobbled lanes of Little Whitechford. Word spread quickly, as it always did in a village where even the delivery of fresh fish could provide 3 days' worth of speculation. Mrs. Isabel Price, newly returned, elegantly dressed, mysteriously glamorous, was dead. A teacup had played a role, or so it seemed. Poison, some whispered. A stroke, others suggested. But everyone agreed on one point: it was not natural by supper time. Mrs. Penelope Fletcher had already telephoned her sister in Eastbourne, embellishing every detail, with a touch of dramatic flair. They say her lips were blue, like a summer plum, and that she died without a sound, right there at the tea table, with all those people about. No one saw a thing. The poor woman murmured to her sister, though I always thought there was something continental about her, didn't you? Meanwhile, inside the drawing-room of the Vicarage, a hastily convened meeting was underway. Inspector Crail, newly assigned to the region and eager to prove himself, stood by the fireplace. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with the unfortunate habit of speaking with great authority even when quite unsure. Cause of death is under preliminary review, he said, addressing the small gathering of key witnesses. Dr. Hayward suspects poisoning, though it's not yet confirmed. We'll need statements from everyone present. No one is to leave the village without notifying my office. The vicar, Reverend Alfred Temple, looked pale and flustered beside his wife, who, having recovered from her fainting spell, now clutched a teacup with the grip of a woman recently betrayed by one. Colonel Fanshawe stood rigid near the piano, mustache twitching with restrained impatience. Miss Marple, seated demurely on a chintz chair near the bookshelf, sipped her tea prepared in a clean cup from the vicar's kitchen. She said little, though her eyes, as ever, missed nothing. Did anyone notice anything unusual before Mrs. Price collapsed? Asked Inspector Crail, pen poised. Unusual, echoed Bunny Ellison. You mean other than her being poisoned in front of the entire parish council? There's no confirmation of poison yet, Miss Ellison, Crail said, though his tone lacked conviction. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. It was rather curious, wasn't it? She murmured. More to herself than anyone, Mrs. Price insisted on preparing her own tea. Very particular about her leaves, she said, from Darjeeling, specially shipped. Colonel Fanshawe gave a dismissive grunt, one of those modern women restless types. Never could settle back into the English way of things. No structure. And quite friendly with young Arthur Bellamy, added Mrs. Fletcher, who had inserted herself into the circle under the pretext of bringing more cushions. You know, the solicitor's apprentice. She took quite a shine to him, I thought, bit improper. For a widow of her standing, Miss Marple's knitting needles remained still in her lap. She turned her gaze toward the Colonel. Colonel, didn't you serve in India yourself? I did, he replied. Eyes narrowing. 15 years in Punjab. What of it? I was only wondering, she said with a faint smile, whether you and Mrs. Price had ever crossed paths abroad. It is quite the coincidence. To retired persons from the same distant land ending up in the same village, he stiffened. Met her once at a function in Simla. I barely recall it. Didn't much mix with the civil types, always preferred proper army company. Still, Miss Marple said lightly, life does have a way of circling back upon itself, doesn't it? The room lapsed into silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Outside, the village continued to churn in quiet chaos. At the Rose and Thistle, the local public house, the mood was a strange blend of disbelief and exhilaration. For many, this was the most exciting event since the Great Bake-Off scandal of '48. Dead at the tea table, barked Mr. Tom Worthing, the butcher, raising his pint like something from the penny thrillers. I'll wager it was the vicar's marmalade tart, someone else muttered. Don't be daft, replied Mary Thatcher. The barmaid, Mrs. Price, barely touched her food, just sipped her own tea and smiled like a cat who knows a secret. Across the bar, Arthur Bellamy sat alone, staring into a half-drunk shandy. His boyish face was pale, and he tugged nervously at his collar. He had indeed spent time with Mrs. Price, driving her to the post office, helping with her garden gate, and on one occasion carrying a very large trunk from the train station to her home. But he hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone comment. At precisely 7:10, Miss Marple returned home to her ivy-draped cottage on Church Lane. She moved slowly, her mind occupied. She lit a small lamp, fed her canary, and settled in her sitting room with a journal and a plate of ginger biscuits, though she gave no outward sign. Her thoughts were not on the biscuits nor the comforting rustle of the fire. Something had been amiss, several things, in fact. First, Mrs. Price's choice to prepare her own tea, despite the gracious offerings from the vicar's wife, odd for someone trying to re-enter village life. Second, the iron teacup, most of the set was porcelain, a wedding gift to the vicar and his wife, but that one particular cup had not matched. Its dull grey sheen was entirely out of place, and though most saw only a practical replacement, Miss Marple saw something else as a choice, and then there were the glances. Those quiet exchanges when people believed themselves unnoticed. Miss Marple had observed young Arthur flush deeply when Mrs. Price's name was mentioned. She had noted the Colonel's swift dismissal of a shared past. Even the vicar's wife had hesitated a fraction too long when someone asked where the special Darjeeling tea had come from. No, it wasn't right. Miss Marple glanced down at her open journal and wrote 3 names on the first page: Arthur Bellamy, Colonel Fanshawe, and Mrs. Temple. She stared at them for a long while, outside. The church bells chimed 8. Somewhere down the lane a dog barked once, then fell silent. The village, though tucked in for the night, remained restless beneath its polished calm. Miss Marple, however, felt no such unrest. She knew Little Whitechford far too well to believe in accidents, and while others speculated wildly, she simply observed, as always. She trusted that people would tell her who they were if only she listened closely enough. By morning, Little Whitechford had adopted the expectant hush of a village on the edge of scandal. Rain pattered lightly on the cobbles, as if the sky itself had joined the villagers in brooding silence. The post office opened late, the bakery, typically bustling by dawn, had only a single tray of scones behind the counter. Even the birds seemed hesitant in their morning chorus. At the Vicarage, Inspector Crail had taken up a temporary station in the study. He sat behind the Reverend's writing desk, looking uncomfortably out of place among the hymnals and framed lithographs of biblical parables. A young Constable Rowntree, just 3 months out of training, hovered near the door, clearly more eager for action than observation. 3 interviews this morning, Crail muttered, shuffling his notes. Start with the Colonel, then the lad, then Miss Ellison. Rowntree nodded briskly and stepped into the corridor. A moment later, Colonel Fanshawe marched in with the kind of rigid dignity reserved for ceremonial parades and high-stakes golf tournaments. He stood straight as a bayonet, hat in hand, his mouth a firm line beneath his bushy moustache. Colonel Crail began, "Thank you for coming. We'll be brief." "Not much to tell," said the Colonel, his voice gravelly and clipped. "I arrived at precisely 2:15. Was speaking to the vicar about the roof tiles when the tea was served. Sat with Miss Ellison and old Mrs. Pratt. Barely saw the Price woman. You didn't speak to Mrs. Price at all." Fanshawe's moustache twitched. "Bare pleasantries, nice weather, lovely hydrangeas, that sort of thing. We weren't what you'd call close, but you had met before. In India." A pause. "Barely perceptible. Yes, social functions. Years ago, she was married to Charles Price at the time, civil service chap. We moved in different circles, and after she returned to Little Whitechford, I nodded if I passed her in the lane." "That's about it." Crail eyed him for a moment. "You were observed speaking with her briefly near the refreshments tent last week." The Colonel bristled. "She asked if I remembered a particular garden party in Delhi. I said I didn't." End of exchange. "If you're implying something improper, I'm not implying anything," Colonel Crail said, raising a hand. "Just noting inconsistencies. Thank you for your time." Fanshawe exited stiffly, leaving behind a faint scent of tobacco and resentment. Next came Arthur Bellamy. The young man entered with none of the Colonel's composure. His pale face glistened slightly with nervous perspiration, and his hands fiddled constantly, first with his collar, then the edge of his coat. "You knew Mrs. Price well?" Crail asked. Arthur nodded hesitantly. "Not well. I helped her with errands. She paid me a little here and there. I wanted to help with her garden, mostly." Said the place had grown wild since her father passed. "You spent time inside the cottage?" "Yes, sir, once or twice. Only in the front rooms, I swear, just carrying in boxes, helping with the trunk from the station. Was she ever inappropriate with you?" Arthur's eyes widened. "No, never. She was kind. A little intense, maybe. Asked a lot of questions. About the village, about people." "What sort of questions?" Arthur hesitated. "Well, she asked about Colonel Fanshawe, whether he was the same man he used to be. Also asked about the vicar's wife. Said she remembered her from somewhere, but it was fuzzy. Did she ever mention fearing for her safety?" Arthur shook his head. "No, nothing like that, but she did seem cautious, always checking the latch on the door. She told me once." "This place keeps its secrets tightly, Mr. Bellamy. That's why I returned. I didn't really know what she meant." Crail scribbled a note, then dismissed him. The third interview of the morning was with Miss Bunny Ellison, who swept in smelling of lavender and indignation. "I can't imagine why you're speaking to me, Inspector," she huffed. "I found the poor woman. You should be thanking me." "We are thankful, Miss Ellison," Crail replied with forced patience, "but you're also close enough to observe who approached her during the party." "Oh, everyone approached her. She was the main attraction. Everyone wanted to see what India had done to her." "I told Penelope Fletcher that Isabel always had a taste for melodrama, and look now, she's died in a garden party of all things. Most theatrical. Did you see her prepare her tea?" "I did. She brought her own leaves, you know, very dramatic. Wouldn't trust anyone else to touch her cup. She chose a different cup than the rest. Yes, she said porcelain dulled the flavour. Can you believe it? Went into the refreshment tent and plucked out an old iron teacup the vicar's wife uses for flower arrangements. Said it was more authentic. I dare say she wanted to be seen as exotic, and no one else handled her cup. Not that I saw, but then again, I was watching the Colonel at the time. He and Isabel had a falling out years ago, I believe. Something to do with a letter, if I remember correctly." Crail frowned. "What kind of letter?" Bunny leaned forward conspiratorially. "Now, I don't know, but there was talk of it at the time. Something that went missing when she left India." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple was pruning her window box when the vicar's wife, Mrs. Temple, arrived with a nervous air and a basket of lemon scones. "I do hope I'm not interrupting, Miss Marple," she said, glancing around. "I just thought, after everything, some comfort baking might help." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said warmly, inviting her inside. "Do come in, dear." They sat in the parlour, steam rising gently from their teacups. Mrs. Temple looked around anxiously before speaking. "I wanted to ask you if she was murdered." Miss Marple studied her guest's face with interest. "I believe someone wanted her dead." "Yes, though whether they succeeded or she merely helped them along unknowingly remains to be seen. She was so forceful," the vicar's wife whispered. "She made me feel so provincial. She questioned everything. The tea, the cutlery, even asked whether we'd had visitors in the garden recently. Said she could sense disturbances in the air. She seemed to be searching for something," Miss Marple said. "Not just comfort or company." Mrs. Temple shuddered. "I'm ashamed to say it, but I was relieved when she left the kitchen. Something about her unsettled me, and when she asked about our son, well, I thought it strange she even knew we had one." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed, yes. Andrew's been away in Canada for years. She shouldn't have known his name. The rain had stopped by the time Mrs. Temple left, and a sliver of sun broke through the grey clouds. Miss Marple returned to her armchair and took out her notebook again. Now, a new name joined the list, not Andrew Temple, but the unnamed letter. Bunny Ellison had mentioned letters, after all, often told the truth long after tongues went silent. Outside, the iron teacup remained in police custody. But Miss Marple was certain the clue it held was not chemical but human. It wasn't what had been in the cup that mattered. It was who had handed it to her and what they wanted her to remember, the morning after the interviews. Little Whitechford found itself thick with theories. The fog that had rolled in overnight lingered across the village green, curling around the war memorial and slipping through the hedgerows like a creeping whisper. It was the sort of fog that seemed to slow time itself. And in that suspended air, speculation bloomed. At the Rose and Thistle, Mr. Worthing was convinced it was poison, delivered in a bitter twist of romantic jealousy. She must have been carrying on with someone. Those sorts always are. A man scorned. Mark my words, at the grocer's, Mrs. Plimsoll had another angle. It's that young Arthur. He's been acting oddly ever since she came back, all quiet and pale. And those kinds never sit right with mealways skulking about with loose ends in their eyes. But over at St. Michael's Parish Hall, the Thursday morning bridge club took a more pragmatic view. If she'd truly meant to start fresh, said Mrs. Randall, shuffling a deck with fingers like pale spiders, she would have joined something. She never once came to knitting or choir. That tells me she wasn't interested in blending in. She was. Watching whom, do you suppose? Asked Dora Lively, who had a penchant for gossip delivered in delicate, rising tones. All of us, perhaps, said Mrs. Randall grimly. Or just one person in particular. By now, Inspector Crail had begun to draw a tidy circle around his first official suspect, Arthur Bellamy. The boy had a motive, he reasoned. He had the opportunity of being regularly inside the Price cottage, helping her at the party, and seen hovering near the tea table moments before the collapse. He also had no alibi beyond his word, which in the mind of a young inspector was as thin as spun sugar. He and Constable Rowntree stood outside the solicitor's office that afternoon, the old bell above the door jangling weakly as they entered. Mr. Vincent Rothermere, head of the firm and a man of severe parting and watchkine affections, stood behind a desk that looked too large for the room. Arthur's in the back, he said without prompting, filing ledgers. Whatever he's done, Inspector, I'd wager he didn't mean to. That's a rather curious thing to say, Crail replied, arching an eyebrow. Rothermere sighed. Only that he's a boy with too much heart and not enough sense, loyal as they come. He wouldn't hurt a fly, but if you told him it needed squashing for Queen and country, he'd do it and cry about it later. In the back, Arthur sat hunched beside a row of case folders. When he looked up, he didn't appear surprised to see the inspector. Mr. Bellamy, Crail began, I'll come straight to it. There are several accounts that place you near the tea table, within reach of Mrs. Price's cup. Can you account for your actions immediately prior to her collapse? Arthur swallowed and nodded slowly. I was filling her plate. She asked me to bring her some of the strawberry tart. She'd made a fuss about it earlier, and said the vicar's wife always overpowered the cream, so I fetched it when I came back. She was already sipping the tea. I placed the tart beside her and moved away. Did you touch the cup? No, Arthur said quickly. No, I wouldn't. She was very particular about it. Wouldn't let anyone else pour the water, not even the vicar's wife. She said something about trusting only herself. Inspector Crail studied him closely. And yet, she did trust you enough to let you into her home. She paid you for errands. There's a level of intimacy there. Arthur's mouth opened and closed. "She was kind to me," he said eventually, asked about my family, my plans. "I think she was lonely, but she never crossed a line, and I swear I didn't kill her." Krill nodded to Constable Rowntree, who quietly took a note. "We're not charging you, Mr. Bellamy. But until we've ruled out all possibilities, I advise you to remain available." Arthur nodded solemnly, his fingers curling into fists as the two officers left. Elsewhere, another theory was beginning to gain traction. The notion that Colonel Fanshawe, with his proud past and prickly temperament, had more reason to dislike Mrs. Price than he admitted. And it was Bunny Ellison who kept that ember glowing. "It's too convenient, don't you think?" she said later that afternoon while visiting Miss Marple for tea. They were both in India, and she returns, stirs old memories, and ends up dead within the fortnight. Miss Marple served her a biscuit with a delicate smile. "Colonel Fanshawe does not strike me as a man prone to murder," she said, "but he is a man prone to pride, and pride, as we know, often covers fear." Bunny blinked. "Fear of what?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "That, dear, is what I've yet to determine. But did you notice how adamant he was about not recalling the particular event in Simla? And how defensive he became when asked if he'd met Mrs. Price there?" He turned positively scarlet. Bunny huffed. "And he's usually more beige than anything else. Quiet." Miss Marple rose and crossed to her desk. From a drawer, she retrieved a small newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. "I found this in my clippings box," she said, "from 1938, a minor scandal buried in the foreign pages. Charles Price's late husband had been investigated for mishandling funds from a development project in Bengal. The inquiry was dismissed, but rumours abounded, and listed among the advisory officers on the project was Colonel Henry Fanshawe." Bunny's mouth fell open. "You think the scandal wasn't entirely buried?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that Isabel Price returned to England not just for peace, but for leverage." Bunny leaned forward, eyes wide. "You believe she was blackmailing him?" "I believe she had something on him. Something important enough to make someone act. Whether that someone is the colonel, someone else entirely have yet to say." That evening, Colonel Fanshawe sat alone in his study, a whiskey glass in hand, staring at an envelope he had retrieved from a locked drawer. The paper inside was folded, crisply untouched for years. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant and precise. He did not open it. He did not need to. Outside, the wind had picked up, stirring the hedges and sighing through the chimney like an old ghost exhaling. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and then was silent, at the police station. Krill sat with a growing pile of contradictory statements. Every clue pointed to someone different, every motive seemed plausible, but nothing quite fit, and at her cottage, Miss Marple took up her knitting again. She had added a new name to her notebook, Charles Price. The dead husband was, as she always said, often the most alive clue of all, the iron teacup, the foreign tea. The clipped conversations and restless glances, each one hinted not at a crime of passion, but a crime of purpose. The only question left is whose purpose? The days following Mrs. Isabel Price's death took on a quiet unease in Little Whitechford. The village no longer buzzed with gossip. It hummed, low and tense, like a wire pulled so tight. People still visited the post office and the greengrocer, but their voices dropped to murmurs when certain names were mentioned. The usual village rhythm slowed, as though even time itself had paused to wait for the truth to surface. At the heart of it all, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. She made her customary groundstead at the Vicarage, a short visit to the church flower rota committee, and a few polite conversations at the grocer's, but behind each exchange, her mind worked steadily, gently unravelling the knots of contradiction. And motive, it was during one of these seemingly casual visits to Mrs. Webb, the postmistress, that something shifted. Miss Marple had stopped by to inquire after a package of lace edging she had ordered weeks prior. While Mrs. Webb retrieved it from the storeroom, Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the usual clutter of postal counters and bulletin boards. Nothing seemed unusual until she noticed a small bundle of letters tied in twine near the outgoing parcel. "Basket, I do hope I'm not being too nosy," she said, "but are those to be posted today?" Mrs. Webb returned and gave a little sniff. "No, not today. That bundle's from the late Mrs. Price's cottage. Her solicitor brought it in this morning and said he found it in her bureau. Thought it best we send them off before things get too unsettled, may I?" With a shrug of casual permission, Mrs. Webb handed the bundle to Miss Marple. The letters were unremarkable at first glance, thin airmail paper, postmarked for destinations ranging from London to Bangalore, but one envelope caught her eye. It was addressed to a name Miss Marple knew very well. Indira Chakravarti, a retired pathologist now living quietly in South Devon. "I dare say it's a small world," Miss Marple said, turning the envelope gently. "Indira and I once served together on the hospital committee in St. Mary Mead, a most perceptive woman." "Well, perhaps she knew Mrs. Price from India," said Mrs. Webb. "Seems everyone did." But Miss Marple frowned. The address was recent, written in crisp ink, and the return address had not been printed or embossed. It had been written in a different hand altogether, slightly shakier, with heavier pressure on the strokes. It seemed odd for someone like Mrs. Price, known for her precision and style. Would it be terribly improper, Miss Marple asked, if I inquired whether this had already been paid for? Mrs. Webb inspected the stamp. "Odd, it's unfranked. No stamp at all. No stamp," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, "so it wasn't truly ready to post." She tucked the letter back among the others with a gentle smile, thanked Mrs. Webb, and took her lace edging in hand. But her mind had already begun to churn. Later that afternoon, she telephoned Dr. Chakravarti. The two women exchanged pleasantries before Miss Marple gently inquired whether she had recently been in contact with Mrs. Price. "Not directly," Dr. Chakravarti replied. "But I received a very strange postcard from her last month, a view of the Ganges. On the back, she'd written only one sentence: 'Do you still keep your case notes from 1938, and do you?' Miss Marple asked. "I do," came the quiet reply. "I never destroy my notes. They were connected to that inquiry into the Bengali railway development, the one that involved Charles Price." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you know that Colonel Fanshawe was also associated with that same project? I had my suspicions," Dr. Chakravarti said. "He was one of the military liaisons assigned to the region. There was a rumor at the time that some of the missing funds had been funneled into off-books operations, but no one ever proved it. And when Charles Price died in 1942, everything was swept away." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but Isabel didn't forget, and I believe she came back to Little Whitechford not simply to retire, but to finish something that evening." Miss Marple reviewed the notes she had made so far. 3 individuals had distinct ties to the past Colonel Fanshawe through his likely involvement in the Bengal scandal. Arthur Bellamy, whose relationship with Mrs. Price seemed more emotionally entangled than he cared to admit, and now Dr. Chakravarti indirectly pulled back into the mystery by a letter that was never meant to be posted. But as she turned to the final page in her notebook, a thought struck her. The cup, the iron teacup, had always puzzled her. It wasn't just that it didn't match the rest of the service. It was the fact that Mrs. Price had insisted on using it. Why would someone so meticulous, so particular, choose a dull, mismatched cup when elegant porcelain sat waiting? Unless she didn't choose it. Unless someone else had ensured that it would be there, ready and Waiting, with her specialty blender Geeling, she had claimed brought from India, Miss Marple rose and retrieved a folded linen from her bureau drawer. Inside it, carefully wrapped, was a small sample of the same Darjeeling blend she had taken it from the tin in the refreshment tent shortly after the party, just before Inspector Crail arrived. She had intended to test it for poison, but poison wasn't her domain. Behavior was, habits, choices, deviations from the norm, and something about that tea smelled wrong. The following morning, she paid a visit to Dr. Hayward. "I wondered if I might impose upon your curiosity," she said as the doctor prepared tea in his office. "I always enjoy a mystery, Miss Marple," he said with a smile. "Even if it's only the riddle of my receptionist's filing system." She produced the folded linen and explained its contents. Dr. Hayward opened it and took a whiff. Not Darjeeling," he said at once. "There's something else in here. Something earthy, musky. It smells more like tulsi leaves, holy basil, common in Ayurvedic mixtures, not typical in black tea. You say Mrs. Price brought this with her?" She claimed it was Darjeeling. She even insisted on brewing it herself. But what if she didn't prepare it? What if someone else did, and merely allowed her to believe she had? The doctor frowned. Tulsi won't kill anyone, not by itself. But in concentrated amounts, or mixed with certain medications, it could cause cardiac effects. Miss Marple nodded. And if someone knew Mrs. Price's history, her blood pressure, her medications, they might be able to introduce a natural element that would pass unnoticed. As she left the doctor's office, Miss Marple felt the pieces beginning to fit together, not fully, not yet, but enough to form the outline of a design. A misidentified tea, a letter never sent, an envelope written in someone else's hand, and an old scandal that had waited quietly for nearly 20 years. At home, she turned to her journal again and underlined one note 3 times. She didn't choose the cup. She was meant to drink from it. She looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village. Somewhere, a truth was waiting to be unearthed, buried not beneath soil or stone, but under decades of silence and the brittle crust of respectability. And Miss Marple, with her gentle voice and steady gaze, would dig until it was found. The early summer rain had returned to Little Whitechford by the time whispers turned to questions. The village, already unsettled by the sudden death of Mrs. Isabel Price, now found itself humming with discomfort as Inspector Crail's investigation deepened. Suspicion lingered in every polite greeting, every clink of a teacup at the cafe, every hedgerow conversation where one eye was always watching. At the centre of it all, Miss Marple moved with her usual, unremarkable grace, never interrogating, always listening. Her observations folded gently into her memory like pressed flowers in an old book, but even she could sense a shift in the air. It came not from the rain or the clouds, but from the people, restless, tired of secrecy, and unaware that their pasts were beginning to surface whether they liked it or not. It was on Wednesday morning that the first confrontation occurred. Though it came dressed in courtesy, Colonel Fanshawe had been spotted walking toward the post office with a determined stride. Miss Marple, seated beneath the shop striped awning, appeared to notice him only after he greeted her. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said stiffly. "Colonel," she returned with a nod. Taking advantage of the lull in the rain, he looked at her, then hesitated. "May I sit for a moment?" "Of course, always a pleasure." He lowered himself onto the bench beside her, smoothing his coat with care. For a time, they watched the drizzle together. "I've been thinking," he said at last, "about your question the other day, about India." "Oh," Miss Marple said lightly, as if the topic were no more weighty than a new cake recipe. "I did know Isabel better than I let on. She and Charles were entertained often. I was posted in Calcutta for 2 years before the unpleasantness. The inquiry," Miss Marple said gently. Fanshawe nodded. "Yes, I tried to stay clear of it all. but rumours fly in those postings like flies. Over treacle. I heard things missing, corners cut, that sort of rot. But Isabel believed Charles was innocent. She was always convinced someone else had manipulated the accounts. Miss Marple studied him carefully, and did she ever suggest who, she hinted. Once said she had proof, a letter, but I never saw it. We argued about it, and she accused me of cowardice, of protecting someone. She said she'd kept the letter all these years. Said it would surface if anything happened to her. A dangerous claim to make, Miss Marple murmured. She was reckless, Fanshawe said, but she wasn't foolish. She knew how to use people. She used Arthur Bellamy, flattered the boy until he thought he was something more than a helper, and she baited me, too, speaking of the past as though it were a rope she still held in her hands. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, and yet you came to the party, sat across from her, shared a tent and tea and the same carefully trimmed conversation. That seems brave. For a man who feared what she knew, Fanshawe gave a harsh chuckle. What else could I do? Flee the village? That would have looked worse. I thought perhaps she changed her mind. Perhaps she was bluffing, was she? I don't know, he said, and for the first time, Miss Marple heard something roar in his voice. But if she had something she never gave it to me. He stood suddenly, brushing non-existent lint from his coat. If there's something to be found. Miss Marple, I hope you're the one to find it. God knows the inspector isn't looking in the right places. She watched him go, her mind already moving through the implications. Fanshawe wasn't lying, not entirely, but there was a shadow in his words, a corner turned away from the light. Later that afternoon, another truth stirred in an unexpected place. Arthur Bellamy had come to Miss Marple's cottage with a folded note in hand. His face was drawn, his eyes redrimmed. I found this, he said simply, in a book she loaned me. A copy of Wuthering Heights. I thought it might be important. Miss Marple unfolded the note carefully. The paper was yellowing but intact. The handwriting is sharp, deliberate. If anything happens to me, look in the blue tin, the one beneath the sewing box. You'll know the letter when you see it. She meant for someone to find this, Arthur said, but not me. I think she meant it for the police, or for Colonel Fanshawe. I'm not sure. I just couldn't keep it. You did the right thing. Arthur, Miss Marple said kindly, where is this? Tin now, in her cottage, he said, but the police sealed it after the autopsy. No one's been allowed in since. Miss Marple nodded. Leave that part to me. And indeed, she did. That evening, she visited Inspector Crail under the pretext of offering condolences and biscuits, after a tactful chat about village matters and the shifting weather. She casually mentioned the note. Crail raised an eyebrow. A letter left. Intentionally, I believe so, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Price was not a woman to do things by chance. Reluctantly, Crail agreed to escort her to the cottage the next morning. It was a still place. Even more so in death, the furnishings were tasteful, but sterile. A few Indian brass figurines rested on the mantel, books lined the shelves in perfect order, and just beneath the window, on a table covered in a lace runner, sat a sewing box. Miss Marple lifted it gently, revealing a shallow drawer beneath. There, tucked into a blue biscuit tin, was a folded envelope. Crail took it with gloved hands and opened it carefully. Inside was a single page, typed. Signed at the bottom in elegant pen, Charles Price. It was a confession, not of guilt, exactly, but of knowledge. The letter recounted how certain funds had been rerouted under military authority, with Charles acting as a reluctant intermediary. It named officers, transactions, and dates. Colonel Fanshawe's name appeared twice, buried among bureaucratic phrasing. It wasn't damning, but it was dangerous, especially to anyone with ambitions or a past they wanted buried. Miss Marple said nothing as Crail read. We'll have to verify this, he muttered. But if this is genuine, it changes everything. She nodded, especially motive. By nightfall, the village hummed louder than before. Fanshawe was seen pacing the edge of his garden. Mrs. Temple left a hasty note cancelling choir rehearsal. Even Bunny Ellison grew quiet, staring for long spells into her teacup. Secrets were rising to the surface, each like a bubble from a deep well, inevitable, silent, and impossible to ignore. And in the hush that followed, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting, one thought turning again and again in her mind. If the letter was enough to kill for, then someone had killed to stop it, and now that it had surfaced, they might very well be tempted to kill again. The sun returned to Little Whitechford the next day, as if the village had earned a reprieve from its gloom. Light spilled over the stone cottages, warming slate rooftops, and catching in the dew-speckled hedges. The village green looked as serene as it ever had. Children played by the duck pond, and a few brave souls ventured out to sweep their steps or air their laundry. But underneath the glow, something had shifted. The discovery of the letter Charles Price's long-buried confession had left a crack in the village's polite surface. People were quieter now, not from fear, but from anticipation. They knew something had broken loose, and they waited, each, in their own way, to see where it would land. Inside the Vicarage, Inspector Crail sat at the small kitchen table, sipping strong tea and scanning the typed confession for the third time. It still unsettled him, not because of its contents, but because of its clarity. It felt too neat, too convenient. Why hide it in a biscuit tin? He muttered aloud, if you're planning to use it. Mrs. Temple hovered near the stove, preparing toast with mechanical precision. I can't imagine what poor Isabel was thinking, she said, though her voice trembled slightly. To keep something like that, it's no wonder someone wished her harm. Crail looked up sharply. Did she ever mention the letter to you? No, never. She turned, but a knife in hand. But she asked about my husband's old filing cabinet, wanted to know if we ever stored parish council correspondence. She said she was researching something to do with civic funds. I thought she was simply being curious. Like always, Crail made a note but said nothing more. His instincts told him something was amiss, but the evidence now pointed squarely at Colonel Fanshawe. Back at his own cottage, the Colonel was pacing. He'd read the letter. Crail had shown it to him the evening before. You expect me to believe this nonsense? He'd barked. That I used army funds to line someone else's pockets, absurd. But the letter says you authorized the account. I was a middleman at best following orders. The real crooks were higher up. They're long dead. But now this ridiculous letter shows up and I'm to be dragged through the mud for something I tried to forget. Then you admit is genuine. Fanshawe had paused. It sounds like Charles. But that doesn't mean I killed his widow. Now, in the privacy of his parlour, he stared down at a small black notebook. Inside were his own records from those years, coded entries, written in tight block letters. He flipped through them, looking for one in particular. When he found it, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he tore the page out, folded it twice, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. He had one more person to speak with. Across the village, Miss Marple received a knock at the door just after 11. To her mild surprise, it was Arthur Bellamy. He looked pale again, as if sleep had eluded him, and he clutched a newspaper awkwardly in both hands. I saw something, Miss Marple, he said quickly, in the Times. She ushered him inside. It's about Mrs. Price. Well, not exactly. It's an obituary. He opened the paper and pointed. It was a short column tucked beneath a list of diplomatic appointments. Dr. Emmanuel Carter, retired senior officer, British Consular Services India Division, passed away peacefully in Sussex, survived by no immediate family. Known for his contributions to Anglo-Indian infrastructure negotiations, Miss Marple read. The entry, lips pursed. "I recognize the name," she said softly. "He was one of the names mentioned in Charles Price's letter." Arthur nodded. "That's what caught my attention. But it gets stranger. I remembered Ms. Price had a framed photograph in her sitting room of a garden party in Delhi. He was in it." "She must have kept it all these years," Miss Marple murmured. "I think she knew he was dying. Maybe she came back because she knew time was running out, that he was the last person alive who could confirm what Charles wrote." Miss Marple considered this. But if she wanted to expose the truth, why wait? Why brew her own tea and isolate herself? Arthur looked uncomfortable. "There's something else. I didn't tell the inspector because I didn't think it mattered. But a week before the party, Mrs. Price asked me to take a parcel to the train station. A parcel, a small case. She said it was going to a friend in London. But when I got there, she changed her mind, told me to bring it back. I never saw what was in it." Miss Marple's expression darkened. "That parcel may have contained the letter, or something connected to it." Arthur's face was drawn. "I think someone knew she was planning to send it. Maybe they stopped her before she could." That afternoon, another surprise came not from the Colonel nor Arthur, but from an unlikely source. Bunny Ellison. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just before tea, winded and pink-cheeked. "You won't believe what I found," she said, flinging her scarf over the nearest chair. "I was cleaning out the church cupboards and finally got round to clearing the hymn books, and I found this." She produced a small leather-bound journal. "It belonged to Andrew Temple," Bunny whispered. "The vicar's son." Miss Marple frowned. "He's been in Canada for years, hasn't he?" "So they say," Bunny replied. "But this journal is dated just last year. He was here, quietly, briefly. He wrote about meeting some Ioneth woman from the past. He called her, said she brought back things better left forgotten." Miss Marple took the book and scanned the pages. The entries were sparse, emotional, but unmistakable. Andrew Temple had returned to Little Whitechford in secret. He had met Mrs. Price, and he had feared what she might reveal. Why wouldn't the vicar and his wife say anything? Bunny asked. "Because perhaps they didn't know," Miss Marple murmured. "Or perhaps they knew and wanted to forget." She rose, the journal still in her hands. Pieces were sliding into place slowly. But surely this wasn't a simple murder. It wasn't about money alone. It was about memory, about the fear of what the past might reveal, especially when buried beneath years of English civility. Outside, the sun had begun to set, streaking the sky with amber and violet. Shadows stretched long across the village. In one of those shadows, someone waited. Someone who had killed once to keep a secret, and now, as the threads pulled tighter, they might feel the need to strike again. Miss Marple knew the storm hadn't passed. It was only just beginning. There was something oddly peaceful about Little Whitechford the next morning, a silence that clung to the hedgerows and lingered in the air like a held breath. The bells of St. Michael's Church rang faintly in the distance, but few villagers were out to hear them. Doors stayed closed longer than usual, curtains drawn, just enough to see but not to be seen. Inside her modest sitting room on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat with her knitting on her lap, though her needles lay idle. She had spent the better part of the night rereading the journal Bunny Ellison had discovered. The entries were scattered, fragmented by time and emotion, but the sentiment was clear. Andrew Temple, the vicar's son, had returned to Little Whitechford under a cloud of guilt not necessarily for a crime, but for having known one. Each line of his journal echoed uncertainty, anxiety, and above all, fear. He feared what Mrs. Price remembered, fearing what she might say. And perhaps, more than anyone else, he feared that what had once been buried might come to light and destroy what little remained of the life he'd built elsewhere. Yet Andrew had left again. Quietly, without making a stir. His parents had never mentioned his visit. That silence now rang louder than any confession. Miss Marple placed the journal aside and glanced at the clock on her mantel. It was nearly 10. She stood, wrapped herself in a soft shawl, and stepped into the sunlight. There were 3 visits to make before noon, each one a step toward the truth. The first was to the Vicarage. Reverend Temple answered the door himself. His face was pale, his expression wary. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but strained. "What a surprise. I thought I might bring a jar of my quince jelly. I remembered how fond your wife is of it." "That's very kind," he replied, stepping aside to let her in. The drawing room was quiet. Mrs. the Temple was arranging flowers by the window. "Oh," she said, her smile tight. "Jane, how lovely." Miss Marple handed over the jelly and sat in her usual chair. She let a few minutes pass in light conversation about garden pests and the recent rain before she gently changed the subject. "I came across a journal yesterday," she said. "It belonged to Andrew." Mrs. Temple stiffened. The vicar's hand paused mid-pour as he filled the teapot. "Andrew," he repeated. "Whatever do you mean?" "He was in Little Whitechford last year, briefly. He met with Mrs. Price. He wrote about it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. "We didn't think it necessary to share that," Mrs. Temple said finally, her voice soft. "He didn't stay long." Reverend Temple set down the teapot. He was unsettled, frightened, even. "We told him to let the past be, and Mrs. Price, Miss Marple, asked, what did she want from him? She asked questions," he replied, "about the mission in Calcutta, about what Andrew might have overheard as a young man. We thought she was simply being inquisitive. But Andrew said she threatened to reveal something. He didn't say what. She hinted," Mrs. Temple added quietly, "that his name had been in her husband's letters, that something had been entrusted to Andrew when he was a boy." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But he gave her nothing. He didn't have anything to give." The vicar said, "Only guilt. He'd heard things back then, money being misused, names mentioned in private. He was too young to understand, but old enough to remember." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the floral wallpaper. "Did she threaten to expose him?" "She implied as much," Mrs. Temple whispered. "And we were afraid. Jane, we'd just settled here. We'd worked so hard to leave India behind." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "You did what you thought best for your son, but someone else did what they thought best for themselves." She left the Vicarage shortly after, the jelly untouched on the sideboard. Her second visit was to Colonel Fanshaw's cottage. He opened the door with a frown, but motioned her inside. "You've heard the inspector plans to formally question me again," he said flatly. "I have," Miss Marple said. "And I imagine he'll want to know more about the account records you kept from your years in Bengal." Fanshawe walked to the hearth and tossed another log onto the fire. "I burned the rest last night," he said. "What was left of them? Nothing useful in the unjust shadows of old names. You didn't kill her, did you?" she asked softly. He looked at her, weary and brittle. "No, I hated what she reminded me of, but I didn't kill her. I saw the cup. I saw her pour the tea herself. If she was poisoned, it wasn't in the water." "No," said Miss Marple. "It was in the tea leaves, or more precisely, a substance that mimicked tea, something meant to act slowly. Something disguised in ritual." Fanshawe said nothing. She brewed the tea, Miss Marple continued. But the leaves had already been changed, swapped, by someone who knew her routine, someone who helped her prepare for the garden party, perhaps someone she trusted. "Arthur," Fanshawe muttered. "The boy," Miss Marple shook her head. "No, he loved her, or thought he did, and love, even misguided, would have left a trace, panic, regret. He had none of that, only confusion. But someone else had opportunity, and a motive rooted not in scandal, but in silence." She thanked the Colonel and left, walking now to the final cottage on her list. Bunny Ellison's. The elderly spinster greeted her with a great fuss. As always, come in, come in. I've been watching the lane all morning. Something's in the air, Jane, I can feel it. Have you spoken with the inspector? Has he found anything new? Something old. Actually, Miss Marple said as she entered. An old grievance, a buried memory. Bunny blinked, setting a tray of seed cake on the table. Oh, how grim. Must we talk about such things? Just one thing, said Miss Marple. You said you found Andrew's journal in the church cupboard. That you were sorting hymnals. Yes, Bunny said brightly. Dreadful job, too. Dust and mildew. I nearly sneezed myself cross-eyed. And yet the vicar never mentioned he'd misplaced it. Well, I don't suppose he knew it was missing. Miss Marple leaned forward, eyes soft but unblinking. You planted it there, didn't you? Bunny froze. I believe you found the journal weeks ago. Miss Marple said, but you held onto it, perhaps. You hoped it would never be needed, but when the inspector began to look elsewhere, you wanted to nudge the truth along, without incriminating yourself directly. I never meant harm, Bunny said. Her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't poison Isabel, Miss Marple said, but you knew who did. Bunny's eyes filled. She told me about the letter, about what she planned to reveal. I begged her to reconsider. To let the past lie, she just smiled, said the truth was a stubborn weed, and if it bloomed, it would be no fault of hers. Miss Marple reached across the table and took her hand. Then all that's left, my dear, is to help the truth finish blooming. Bunny nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Outside, the wind had picked up again, scattering the petals from the village rose bushes. The day was bright, but there was a storm gathering just over the hill, and Miss Marple, patient as ever, was ready to stand at its centre. The drawing-room of the Vicarage was warm and filled with the scent of spiced tea and old lavender. Polish. The fire crackled gently in the hearth. Outside, clouds were gathering again, their edges tinged with a stormy grey, as if the weather itself waited for something to be said. Inspector Krell stood beside the fireplace, his arms folded, his brow furrowed in the way of a man who had most of the pieces, but still couldn't see the picture. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, her knitting bag untouched at her feet. She had asked for this gathering. Krell had been reluctant at first, but in the end, curiosity, or perhaps resignation won out. The suspects, those known and unknown, had been invited to attend under polite pretense. Colonel Fanshawe sat upright, his hands resting on the head of his cane, expression unreadable. Mrs. Temple perched beside her husband, wringing a delicate lace handkerchief between her fingers. Bunny Ellison sat quietly, her usual dramatic energy strangely subdued. Arthur Bellamy stood near the door, uncertain whether he belonged there or not. Miss Marple began with her customary softness, her voice steady, her gaze flitting between faces not to accuse but to observe. Thank you all for joining us, she said. It's never easy to discuss such things, but I believe we are owed the truth about what happened to Mrs. Isabel Price. A hush fell over the room. I've spent many hours pondering it, Miss Marple continued. At first, it seemed a straightforward matter. A woman drinks tea and dies, but in Little Whitechford, things are rarely what they seem. There is too much history here. Too many old sins wrapped in new smiles. She paused to glance at Inspector Krell, who nodded stiffly, allowing her the floor. The answer, as it often does, began with something small, a teacup, iron mismatched. Unremarkable except that it did not belong to the rest of the Vicarage. Set Mrs. Price chose it, or so it appeared, to brew her own specialty blend. She claimed it was Darjeeling, but in fact, it was not. It was laced with tulsi and a second compound, meant to slow the heartbeat and cause cardiac arrest in someone already taking hypertension medicate. Iron, gasps filled the room, Mrs. Temple's Hand rose to her mouth, and yet Miss Marple said the most important clue was not in the cup itself, but in the leaves that were switched before the party. Not poisoned in a theatrical, violent way, but altered carefully to deliver death slowly, predictably. It required knowledge, access, and, above all, timing. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the vicar's wife. Mrs. Temple, you hosted the party. You had control of the tent. You were present when Mrs. Price set out her tea things, and you knew, better than anyone, her habit of preparing her own tea. You even had the excuse ready for her fussiness, her airs, her sense of superiority. But you underestimated her persistence. Mrs. Temple stood suddenly. I never have. But Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. You didn't mean to kill her in malice, did you? You meant to protect your husband, your son, the memory of your years abroad. You feared that if her letter came to light, your family would be ruined. The vicar looked at his wife. Stunned, she sat down again, lips trembling. She came here to dig, Mrs. Temple whispered, to unearth things better left buried. My son was a boy when he heard those names. He didn't even understand what he heard. But she said he would be named. That people would ask why he'd been in those rooms, how he came to possess that letter. What would that have done to him, to us? Miss Marple's tone was kind, but firm, and so you acted. You altered the tea leaves a few days before the party, just enough to affect her heart. It would seem like natural causes, especially in someone of her age and condition. You counted on her insistence to handle her tea herself. You thought the deception untraceable. Inspector Crail stepped forward, and the letter I never saw it. Mrs. Temple whispered, I swear it. I only knew she had something. She told me she'd leave it with someone safe. I thought if I acted quickly, it would all pass quietly. Colonel Fanshawe shifted in his chair. So it's done, then, he said. Voice low, it was all for that cursed letter. Miss Marple turned toward him. Yes and no, you had your own secret, Colonel. You benefited from the cover-up in Bengal, and I imagine you knew Charles Price had written something down, perhaps even suspected Mrs. Price had held onto it, but you didn't kill her. You came to that party ready for a confrontation, not a murder. He looked down at his cane, not denying it. And Arthur, Miss Marple said, turning to the young man near the door. You loved her, or admired her, in your own way. You were a pawn, dear boy, used for errands and distraction. But your conscience is clear. You were simply too trusting. Arthur gave a small, relieved nod, though his face was pale and bunny. Miss Marple said softly, you were her friend, in a way, and you found Andrew Temple's journal before anyone else. You hesitated. You hoped the past would stay hidden. But you saw where it was going, and in the end, you chose to help the truth out of its hiding place. Bunny's chin wobbled, but she said nothing. Inspector Crail stepped forward again. Voice official now, Mrs. Temple, I'll need you to come. With me, we'll make a statement. There was no protest, no denial, only a quiet acquiescence as she rose, smoothed her skirt, and kissed her husband's cheek. I only wanted peace, she said. Reverend Temple said nothing, only lowered his eyes. As the door closed behind them, silence fell again. This time, it was deeper. Not the silence of secrets, but the hush that follows truth. Miss Marple reached down and lifted her knitting. Her fingers worked the needles without thought, as natural as breathing. Colonel Fanshawe stood and approached her. You knew, he said. You always knew. No, she replied. I only listened. People always tell you who they are, Colonel, if you let them speak long enough. He nodded and left, the cane tapping softly behind him. Arthur lingered a moment, then stepped out into the sunlight. And Bunny, still quiet, offered a shy smile before she departed, closing the door behind her. Miss Marple sat alone, the fire crackling gently. Outside, the clouds were beginning to part. The village would return to normal soon, the shops would open, the children would play, and tea would be poured once again. But little Whitechford would remember, not the scandal, not quite, but the lesson. That truth, no matter how old, will rise when it must, and somewhere beneath the teacup. It always had. It was 2 days later that the church bells tolled again, but this time they rang not for mourning, nor for scandal, but for something simpler. A return to quiet, the village of Little Whitechford, so recently the setting of dark revelation, had begun to knit itself back together with that most English of instincts, a firm upper lip, a fresh pot of tea, and the conviction that life must go on. The rain had passed, the sky, now washed clean, stretched pale blue over tidy hedgerows and gardens in bloom. Lavender was in season. The baker's window was once again filled with neat rows of scones and fruit tarts, and the Rose and Thistle reopened its back room for Thursday darts with only a single comment about poison, and that from Tom Worthing, quickly hushed by his wife. Though the village resumed its rhythm, something beneath it had shifted, however. Subtly, the conversations were a touch more careful, the glances a second longer. And when the name of Isabel Price was spoken, it was with a peculiar mixture of admiration and unease. She had not been popular, not exactly, but she had noticed, and that, perhaps, is the greater legacy in a place like Little Whitechford. At the Vicarage, the air was subdued. Reverend Temple carried on with his sermons, his wife no longer by his side. Her absence was explained gently as a retreat to care for an ailing cousin. Those few who knew better chose not to say otherwise. In truth, Mrs. Temple had been taken quietly into custody. There would be an inquest. The case, built on circumstantial evidence, would take its time moving through the proper channels. But the letter, the tea leaves, and her own quiet confession to Miss Marple would form the spine of a prosecution. There was no vindictiveness in the village, only sadness. Miss Marple, for her part, resumed her daily routine. On Monday, she picked up wool from Mrs. Harper's shop. On Tuesday, she brought lemon curd to the church ruffle, and on Wednesday, she was seen trimming her rose bush with the same care she had once applied to uncovering a murderer. But on Thursday, she received a visitor. Arthur Bellamy stood at her garden gate, hat in hand, eyes apologetic. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Not at all," Miss Marple said, motioning him in. "Come have some tea." They sat beneath the arbour, dappled light falling between the leaves, the scent of honeysuckle drifting in the breeze. "I wanted to thank you," Arthur said, after a few sips, "for everything." "There's no need to thank me," Miss Marple replied. "Though I imagine it's been a difficult week," Arthur nodded. "I've been thinking about her. About Mrs. Price. I didn't really know her. Not the way I thought I did. She was always just out of reach. She was a complicated woman," Miss Marple said gently. "But she saw something in you, Arthur. Perhaps someone who reminded her of herself. Long ago, she said I should leave this village, that I was wasting time here." He looked down at his cup. Maybe she was right. Miss Marple smiled. She may have been. But sometimes it's not about the place, dear boy. It's about what you do within it. Arthur nodded slowly. Then, reaching into his coat pocket, he drew out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I found this among her things," he said. "The parcel I was supposed to post, the one she changed her mind about. I never opened it. I think it's meant for you." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, then took the parcel and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a thin bundle of papers, yellowed. At the edges, a letter sat on top, written in a firm, familiar hand. "To Jane Marple, if you are reading this, then you've likely guessed most of it. There are things I could never say aloud. Some because they hurt too deeply. Others because they would not have been believed. But I trust you to understand the difference between the two. This is the truth I could not bring to light while I lived. Not for fear of scandal, but for fear of what it would do to the living. And yet the truth must live somewhere. Thank you, Isabel Price. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then gently folded it and replaced it in the packet she was preparing. For the worst, she said softly, but also for the right person to finish what she started. Arthur looked uncertain. What will you do with it? Miss Marple poured more tea. Sometimes the truth must come to light. Other times it must rest. I shall read what she's given me. I'll decide after. They sat quietly for a moment, letting the sounds of the garden fill the silence, the soft trill of a bird in the distance, the rustle of a breeze in the ivy. You were brave, Arthur, she said at last, braver than most. You stood firm when it counted. He looked surprised. I didn't do much. You listened, you remembered, and you came forward when it mattered. He smiled, a small one, but real. When he left, the gate clicked shut behind him with a quiet finality. Miss Marple returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and resumed where she'd left off. She did not read the rest of the papers that day. There would be time. For now, peace had returned to the village, and she saw no reason to chase it away. Later that afternoon, Benny Ellison dropped by with a basket of poppy seed cake and news from the Bridge Club. Colonel Fanshawe had retired from public life, she said, and the vicar had declined to stand for re-election to the parish committee. The old rhythms would return, slowly, but nothing would be quite the same. Benny asked, too, whether Miss Marple believed justice had been done. To that, Miss Marple only said, "Justice is often untidy, dear, but truth tends to find its way, even if it takes the long road." That night, as the village lights flickered out one by one, a hush fell over Little Whitechford once more. The roads were empty. The fields stretched quiet under moonlight. And in one ivy-draped cottage, a small lamp burned gently beside an armchair, where a woman sat, knitting steadily. She had seen the best and worst of people. She had uncovered lies hidden beneath the gloss of politeness, and yet she believed deeply and without question that good people still outnumbered the wicked. That, in the end, was what made her such a fine detective, and what made her always a comfort to those left behind.